Okay. Showtime.
Well, you know, it's mid-August in Sacramento, and I'm sitting in the family room of my very lovely home, and my son John has come up and has helped me with several projects. That was John. And it's kind of nice to sit here being a mature citizen now and to reflect on a lot of things that I've experienced in my life. And when you've had the number of birthdays that I've had, you have a whole treasure trove of memories that you can call on and dredge up and pull out of storage, and some of them are alphabetized and some aren't. But it's awfully nice to sit back and look at some of the things I've done and experienced, and some of the joys and the pleasures and the sorrows and the disappointments and the happiness that have gone on in my life. My first recollection is one that occurred in Redondo Beach. And I think I was about 4 years old. I was born in Breckenridge, Minnesota. But my family left Breckenridge before I have any recollection of that. My dad was a fireman on the Great Northern Railroad. And they apparently had a roundhouse or a marsh.
It's on. Marshalling yard in Minnesota.
There was apparently a marshalling yard or a railroad roundhouse or some kind of a facility there. My dad was a fireman on the Great Northern, and from what I understand, a very good one. They had trains as long as a mile in length, and that was in 1922, and that was a pretty powerful engine, so the fireman had a steady job on the run. There was a strike either in late 22 or early 23, and it was pretty violent. And I understand there were severe beatings. I've learned since then that there were some shootings and beatings. So my dad loaded his little family in what I think was a Studebaker touring car, and they drove to Yakima, Washington. And the roads were not freeways in those days, as you will have surmised already. They picked apples for a living, and Dad worked his way down the coast and ultimately went to work for a contractor by the name of Miracle. And that's how he wound up in Redondo Beach. He was working for, honestly and truthfully, a man by the name of O.U. Miracle. I don't know how long we were in Redondo Beach, but we left and went to San Diego, where Mr. Miracle had quite a contract just east of San Diego to develop roads and substructure, the storm drains and the sewers and the sidewalks and the driveways and the curbs and the gutters and all of that sort of thing. They did their work in those days with mules. Tractors were not unknown, but they weren't in great supply, and they were not very well used on construction jobs. And the mules would pull implements. There was a Scarefire, which was a square metal frame, perhaps 5 or 6 feet square on each side, and it had railroad spikes welded to the frame that stuck down 6 or 8 or 10 inches. And you would drag that was a spike-tooth harrow, not a Scarefire, excuse me, spike-tooth harrow. So you would tie a couple of mules in their harness to that, and then you'd stand on that spike-tooth harrow, and the mules would drag it across the dirt, and they would loosen the dirt down 1.5 inches or 2, maybe 3 inches. Then the Scarefire would come along, and the Scarefire would push that dirt into little long furrows, and then you would bring a Fresno along, which was a bucket like you see on the front end of a skip loader now, or front loader, and it had a handle on the back, and the man would pull the handle down, the handler, and you'd fill up this Fresno with dirt, and you'd pull it up to the top of a little hill, and there'd be a little grate there, and you'd tip up the Fresno, and it would dump that quarter, half a yard of dirt down through a grate to screen out the big rocks, and you dump it into a wagon down below, pulled by 4 mules, and that was a drop-bottom wagon. Then the wagon would go out on the job site, and the man would pull a lever, and the wagon would open up, and a little bit of dirt would spill out, and that's the way they did their work. I can remember standing on the corral rail on Euclid Avenue, north of El Cajon Boulevard in San Diego, when I was probably 6, maybe 7, 6 or 7, and watched my father handle mules. Now, mules can get to be very large animals. They're larger than most horses, and they can weigh 22 to 2,400 pounds, not unusual. And they can be very, very mean. And my father would use a twitch, and he would put the twitch on his left wrist. The twitch is a circle of chain that runs through a hardwood handle. And that handle then has a chain through it. The hardwood handle was about 1 foot long. And he would get a hold of the mule's nose, very big soft nose, and put that chain over the nose. Then he would turn that handle until the chain tightened, and when the pain started, that mule would raise his head. And the mule was very docile as long as you had that twitch on his nose. And my father would lead them around the corral and back them into their harness. He'd drop.
Okay.
And when the twitch began to hurt, you could back that mule or lead that mule anywhere you wanted to. And I've watched my dad handle mules that way. And it was an interesting experience for a young fellow. He graduated to trucks, and the first truck that he drove was a hard rubber-tired Federal, and the steering wheel came straight up out of the wooden floor, and it had a spark control here and a throttle control here, and the gear shift was in the middle with a clutch and a brake. And when I say hard rubber-tired, that's what I meant. There was no air in the tires. They were just hard rubber on a metal rim, a little rough riding. Gradually, technology worked its magic, and he got into bigger trucks and more modern trucks, and I rode with him every summer vacation. I spent a lot of time with my dad. I was very close. I was one of 5 children. I was the 4th. An older brother, Bud, 10 years older than I. My sister, Dorothy, was 8 years older. Les was 5 years older. And Jack, my little brother, was 8 years younger than I. But Dad and I were very close, and I spent an awful lot of time. When I was 14, I was driving a Federal truck and trailer, I beg your pardon, an autocar truck and trailer from San Diego to Colton to pick up 15-ton of cement on the truck and 12-ton on the trailer. And my dad would sleep, and I'd drive that rascal back home, and that was on, again, not on freeways. But it was a very, very happy childhood. We didn't have a great deal of money, but I was very much loved by my mom and dad, very much loved. Mom used to take in boarders to help with the income, and on Saturday she'd cook all sorts of things, potatoes and roasts, and she'd make cakes and pies, and she'd do vegetables and fruits, and she'd have all sorts of things, and she'd set that out on the dining room table. And then the family and the boarders was kind of like a smorgasbord arrangement. When you were hungry, you went and ate, and if you weren't hungry, you didn't eat. That was up to you. But Mom got to take a little time off on Sunday that way, and we all helped. I was an enterprising young kid. I was not very strong as a very young boy, and I remember going to Hamilton Elementary School. A couple of German boys used to follow me home and pound on me, Marvin and Walter Adkins.
Yeah, but you got back at them later on, didn't you?
Well, they worked me over pretty well sometimes, and that bothered my mother, and she finally called on a friend of ours who was a big, strong, husky fellow, and he waited for me coming home from school one day and saw them work me over, and he worked them over pretty well. But I was never very daring as a very young fellow. My grades were good until I got into high school, and I didn't do too well there. I loved to work. I always had a job as a youngster, either a paper route or a... And there's an interesting story. I delivered the San Diego Union. I had a little over 300 customers. I worked for Mr. Brown, and that's when I got my Social Security number. I was about 14. That would make it about 1936. And one morning, I had been to the beach with my sister and my brother, Dorothy and Les, and one morning I was so sunburned I couldn't make it. And my dad called Mr. Brown about 3 o'clock in the morning, and Mr. Brown apparently was being a little abusive to my dad, and my father spoke up for me in a fashion that I'll never forget. He told Mr. Brown where he could go and how he could get there and what he could do when he arrived. And that took care of the argument. Mr. Brown delivered my papers that morning. I made it the next morning, but Dad was right there supporting his boy.
You remember what happened when I had my route? That guy in L.A. that kept trying to cheat me?
Yes.
Every month you'd catch him trying to screw me out of 20 or 30 bucks?
Yes, I sure do. That's the way dads are.
Hey, that's what dads are for.
That's what dads are for. The next incident that stands out in my life is one that came after the paper route. I was working for the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company. My older brother, Les, who was 5 years older than I, worked for them, and he got me a job in the truck tire department. I had gone on through school through the 11th grade, and I was expelled in my junior year for smoking. So I had to get my diploma later on, and we'll talk about that later. I worked for the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company downtown, and I was a good worker, an industrious young guy, and I ultimately became the night manager. Now that should be put in quotes because it's not what you think. The store was a block square, and you couldn't close the store, so you had to keep it open 24 hours a day. So at night we would sweep the floor and clean out the restrooms and do all sorts of wonderful things so that in the morning they could open up for business with a nice clean store. We were inside about midnight one night. I had a helper. I had one fellow reporting to me. I must have been about 17 then. I would think so. And we were inside the glass enclosure where they had the horns and the wheel rims and all of the sorts of wonderful things you were selling for automobiles in. And 2 fellows walked in and wanted to use the restroom, and I told them where it was, and they went ahead and used it and came out, and they each pulled out a gun. And they said, "This is a stick-up," which was pretty obvious by that time. So we went out to the cash register, and we had a safe in the floor, and every so often we'd poke the bills in the safe. There wasn't much money there, less than $100. And so they said that we took care of some trucks for the San Diego Steam Laundry. And they picked out the latest model truck, and they said, "Get in." So they both got in the back. There were no windows in the back. It was kind of a van. And I drove, and my helper was in the right seat, and we each had a gun in the back of our head here. And he said, "I'll tell you when to turn." So he kept telling me when to turn, and we drove up to a little hilltop area north of San Diego called Kearney Mesa. It's well developed now, but it wasn't developed then. And then we drove along for a mile or two, I don't recall, and they said, "All right, stop and get out." So I thought, well, I guess I'm going to get shot now. But I didn't, obviously. And they pushed us out of the truck, and then they got in the truck and drove off. And we walked several miles back to Highway 101 to an all-night restaurant at the north end of Mission Bay. And there was a police patrol car there. 2 policemen were in having coffee and donuts. Must have been 1 o'clock in the morning then or so. And we both had on our Firestone uniforms, and we had a dickens of a time convincing them that we'd been held up and robbed and kidnapped. And finally, I said, "Well, you've got to get somebody down there to watch the store, and you're going to have to find somebody to take us back, because I'm responsible for that store. And people could strip it clean." So they finally agreed, and they took us, they called it on their little radio. And when we got back to the store, there were a couple of prowl cars there, and sure enough, the truck was missing, and we were not there, and they believed us at that time. And so they then started a hunt for the 2 bandits who finally were caught. And the funny part of that whole story is that the San Diego Union closed their morning paper about 1:30 in the morning. And then at 4:30, They would deliver these papers, and at 5:30 the boys would deliver them all to the homes and so on. And the story of our kidnapping was in the San Diego Union. And my family took the San Diego Union. So my father got up early to go to work, as he usually did. And he opened up his San Diego Union, and here's the story in the paper about his son being kidnapped. So he got in his car and drove down to the store real fast, and was very, very pleased to see that I was not harmed. But that was quite an interesting episode. I was going with a girl at that time by the name of Peggy Leonard, who was a very nice young lady. Her mother, Fran, worked for the telephone company, and she worked in one of the construction offices in San Diego. And we got along fine, and my father knew Peggy's uncle, Ed, I'm sorry, I've forgotten the name, Ed Hartz or Ed Harding. And so Peggy's mother, when I would go over to visit Peggy, persuaded me to put my application in with the telephone company. That was in 1940. And in 1941, after several attempts on my part to get on while I was working at Firestone, and later on at Ryan Aircraft Company, the telephone company hired me. That was on the 17th of July, 1941. And in on December the 7th, as you recall, we experienced Pearl Harbor. And so immediately several of my friends and I wanted to volunteer for active duty, but we couldn't because we were in a critical occupation in communications. So I had to get a release from the company. And a friend of mine, Jimmy Curtis, and I took the cadet exam to go into the Army Air Force. We both passed, and we were accepted as cadets. And they put us into what was then called the Enlisted Reserve Corps until the cadet opening came along. And I got a little impatient, so I wrote to the commanding general of whatever it was, some army out here in California, and asked for active duty. And he gave me active duty all right. He said to report for duty, you report MacArthur, and I would be assigned to the field artillery at Camp Hahn in Riverside, California. And I was. So I had to take the exams all over again. I requalified, and that took me through 1942, and in February of 43, I was ordered to report to Nashville, Tennessee for classification for training as an Air Force. I had hoped pilot. I made it through that. I went to pre-flight school at Maxwell Field, Alabama, where I qualified as a pilot. I was a cadet officer during each one of my training periods, the pre-flight, primary, basic, and advanced. I had very good ratings. I was 27th in a class of 600 of us started, 400 and some graduated. And I've forgotten the number now, it's in a book somewhere. I was 27th or 28th, and I was rather proud of that, being a high school dropout. I was sent to Avon Park, Florida, where I trained with the crew. I was a co-pilot. I was assigned as a co-pilot at that time. I met the girlfriend of my ball turret gunner, Catherine Beatty, and met her in Wauchula, Florida, and fell madly in love, and we were married in Atlanta, Georgia. We'd gone together for a long time, about 6 or 7 weeks, I guess it was. And we were married 3 or 4 days, and I went overseas as a co-pilot. And we flew, we were assigned 25 missions, about 18 or 20, number 18 or number 20, they increased that to 30, and we ultimately flew 30 missions, beginning in April and finishing in, I believe, August or September of 1944. Very heavy flying, very heavy flying. That was in the heavy part of the war. We did not have fighter escort other than just across the channel when we started flying. And by the time we finished, we had fighter escort most, if not all, the way. That did not mean that the same group of fighters would take us all the way. One group would take us to point A, and another one would pick us up and take us to point B, and sometimes we'd have as many as 7 or 8 different fighter groups that would fly escort for this long bomber train. The training in B-17s was interesting. You very seldom flew in training with all 4 engines. It was emergency procedures. You take off with 4 and lose 1. You take off with 3 and lose 1. You in flight have a fire and feather 2 of them. You couldn't get your gear down. You can't get your gear up. The radios don't work. The oxygen, you have an oxygen failure. We used to use glycol heaters in the B-17. We had to get rid of those in combat because glycol would flame at certain temperatures. And then you'd have a glycol failure and all manner of things. The window would be blown out. The pilot or co-pilot would be blinded. The one wheel would go down and the other one wouldn't, or one would come up and the other one wouldn't. And it was always an emergency in the training. I was blindfolded and had to touch and identify, I think it was 141 or 114 gauges and switches and knobs and handles in that cockpit and describe to the instructor pilot what it was and what it was for. So it was not really easy. But I tell you all of that because when we got overseas, we flew several practice missions. We had to get familiar with English radio procedure and with English homing devices and navigation devices. And my first raid was to Friedrichshafen, Germany, which was one of the rocket or buzz bomb assembly plants. And it was an absolutely gorgeous day, and Friedrichshafen is in southern Germany, as you may know. And you could see the Alps, so beautiful. There was no fighter activity, very, very little flak. All 4 engines worked all the way. And I really was astonished and astounded at how much easier combat flying was than flying in training. That was until the next mission. But even all the missions were an exciting time for a young fellow. I was 21 when I went overseas. I checked out as a pilot after a couple of raids as an aircraft commander. And I recall on June the 5th, my birthday, 1944, I was 22 that day, we were awakened about 10:30 in the evening to brief for what became D-Day, June 6th, 1944. And that was a rather memorable birthday present. And we took off at about 2 or 2:30 in the morning, maybe 3, and it took an enormous amount of time to assemble. You must reflect here that to get 1,200 bombers in the air, in the right place, at the right time, at the right altitude, takes an enormous amount of planning and logistics, and they have to carry the right amount of fuel, the right amount of ammunition, the right bomb, or bombs. And to put all that together and get them to take off at 30-second intervals and climb out on a predetermined heading and assemble on a certain color of flare, red, 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 yellow, blue, green, blue, yellow, red, blue, whatever it was, that was your leader firing flares up through his stationary flare pistol in the ceiling of his B-17. And you would see that, and then you would get over there in the dark, no lights, because you have enemy aircraft in the air, and you'd be assembling on the flames coming out of the exhaust pipes of the B-17s ahead of you. That was thrilling. That was very thrilling, even as thrilling as combat. And once you assembled into a group then, and that group would be 3 squadrons of 6 aircraft each. You have 2 elements of 3 each in the lead squadron, that's 6 airplanes, 2 elements of 3 each in the low squadron and the high squadron. So that's 18 B-17s, 180 men in a group. Then you have 3 groups in a wing, Then you have 3 wings in a division. And you have 3 divisions in an Air Force. And to assemble and get on track for your target at the right time, at the right altitude, in the right position, so that you're neither too far apart nor too close together, is an enormously complex and complicated undertaking. I don't think anyone appreciates that. I have the greatest and most profound respect for the people on the ground who did all these wonderful things about the timing and the loading and taking care of the machines and doing all this stuff that enabled us to do that. There were a lot of mid-air collisions. A lot of B-17s blew up on takeoff. A lot of pilots would become disoriented on takeoff and spin right into the ground. When we flew in a wing formation, that is, when we always flew in a wing formation, in a division formation, but the wing commander had to have a qualified pilot as a tail gunner in his B-17, because the wing commander could not see behind him, and he had little or no idea of what was taking place with his wing and subsequent wings back in the bomber trail, or bomber train. So I was designated, after I'd flown several missions, to be the observer on one raid. So I flew as a tail gunner in a B-17, sitting on my legs for 9 hours, breathing oxygen. No, you can't get up and walk around. And it was a Berlin raid, and on takeoff, one of the B-17s down below us, in a low group, flew into another one, cut his tail off, and they both spun in and blew up. And I had to tell the wing commander what was going on. I had to tell him when we had fighters coming in from the rear. And we were attacked by fighters over Berlin, several fighters. And I squirted out several rounds with these twin 50s, but I didn't have enough azimuth or swing to the guns, and the fighters knew that. They stayed just a little beyond my azimuth, and all the other tail gunners' azimuth. But that was a different perspective on an air war, to sit in the tail gunner's position, than it was to sit in the pilot or the co-pilot seat and see what was going on ahead of you. I'd rather be in the pilot or co-pilot seat. But when we got back from that raid, true story, I had to be helped out of that tail gunner's position, which was cramped for a fellow my height, and I almost screamed when we straightened out my legs, and I laid there on the ground for quite a long time to get the circulation going before I could get up and maneuver. But that's all part of the combat experience. One of the memorable points in my combat, two memorable points, well, 3 really in my combat tour. One was a raid over Roulande, where one of the groups turned too soon and we turned too late, and we had to make a turn over the target. And so we were much too close behind the group ahead of us, much too close. And we saw them being blown up, parachutes coming out, burning gasoline, burning the parachutes, bodies tumbling through the formation. It was very, very horrendous experience.
Is that in Russia?
No, that was in Roulande, Germany, over Roulande, Germany. The Roulande was bombed several times. It was a major oil refinery. But that's the only time in my life that I honestly believed I was going to die. I didn't see how anyone could get out of that. We lost some people, not out of my crew, but in our group. We lost some people on that raid. That was a tough one. In fact, we were shot up, if I recall correctly, and had to leave formation on the way back across the channel and call for fighter cover, and we flew home alone. We threw everything out of the airplane we could get out and got back on 2 good engines. Another memorable raid was the shuttle raid to Russia, where we were going to drop bombs on a German target, land in Russia, eat, sleep, refuel, rebomb, drop bombs on a German target, land in England, eat, sleep, refuel, rebomb, and do this on a shuttle basis. And the Russians were responsible for our protection while we were there. And this was a raid on Poltava, and there was a book written about that called The Poltava Affair. We took 72 B-17s to Russia and we brought 6 home. The rest were destroyed on the ground. We didn't lose all those people. The Air Transport Command came in and flew the people home. My B-17 was flyable, one of the 6, and we flew home through the Middle East to Tehran and Cairo and Tripoli and Casablanca and back to England. And I knew that when we got to England that we would be treated really as heroes, and that there would be great acclaim and much waving of flags and all that sort of thing. So we flew around Spain and France back to Land's End, which is the southwestern tip of England, and landed at a base that had a grass field. We had been given the radio codes and all the signals, and we were told by the tower to taxi to the farthest end of the field, and 2 British vehicles came out with medical personnel and guns full of DDT, and they squirted that stuff all over the airplane and up our pant legs and down our shirt collars and in our armpits and everywhere else to be sure we didn't bring some terrible bug home from the Middle East. I can understand why they had to do it, but that wasn't the welcome that I had expected.
Where's Poltava?
Poltava is in the southern Ukraine, near a town called Meherod. We spent 10 days in Russia, 4 of them in Poltava and 6 in Meherod.
Was Poltava the target?
No, Poltava was where we were going to refuel and rearm and sleep and eat and then go back to bombing Germany, but we couldn't do that. The Russians provided terrible, terrible defense. Their anti-aircraft guns were manual, there was no radar. They had P-39s, Bel Air Cobras as fighter cover. Again, they were no good at night. The Germans had occupied that country for 2 or 3 years. The first flare, they didn't get dark till 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, got light at 3 in the morning. The first flare, they low-level bombed and high-level bombed for quite a long time. We all ran out of our tents for the slit trenches that they had dug. I was the #1 man in a ditch and had 2 people on top of me, and they were dropping. They weren't after the people, they were after the airplanes. And we had lined those 2 B-17s up on steel mats on a grass field, 2 rows of 36 B-17s each, when any place else to park. And they destroyed 63 of the 72 on the ground. And we laid in that trench with 1,000-pounders going off out on the runways, maybe 2,000, 3,000 feet away. And the bottom of that trench would come up and hit you right in the face. There were several, most of the Russians were women, middle-aged to old-aged women, and very old men. There weren't any middle-aged or young Russian women and men. They were either dead or in the service or on the front lines, which was only about 60 or 70 miles away. So we made it through the night. They sent women out to clear the butterfly bombs, and the Germans had dropped, I don't know how many thousands of anti-personnel butterfly. Butterfly bomb is a bomb that has wings on it. And if you touch it when it's on the ground, the spring is released and it jumps into the air about waist high and then blows you in half. And several Russian women were killed early the next morning as they were trying to clear the field so we'd get our flyable B-17s out of there. So we were taken by truck to Meherod, which was not very far away, must have been 15 miles or less, and we slept out in the bushes for 7 days and ate C&K rations, and then came back. ATC came in and flew out the people, the other 630 men, and those of us who could fly a B-17, who had B-17s that were flyable, flew them home through the Middle East on this trip back to England. The third memorable experience was my last raid. On the way home through the Middle East, my crew and I would pick up bottles of any kind of liquor you could get. And in Casablanca, you could get pink champagne, green champagne, blue champagne. You could get all sorts of strange concoctions. And we bought several bottles of several different kinds of concoctions, and took it back to our home base with us. When we flew our last mission, we dropped supplies to the Spanish and French Maquis, and they were in the Pyrenees in southern France, and they were tying up 2 or 3 German divisions with guerrilla activity. Our drop zone was 3 fires on 3 hilltops about a mile apart, and we dropped from, I have it in my diary, my memory tells me about 6,000 feet. And here we had all these hundreds of B-17s, and we lined up in single file. And we would drop canisters of food, ammunition, liquor, medicine, supplies, bandages, small arms, all manner of things in this big triangle. And then they would come in and pick up these canisters. And then we reassembled from single files into our squadron and group formations and flew back north to England. And just before we got to the English Channel, we were over France, I called the group leader and I said, I'm having a little engine trouble, I'm going to feather number 1. And I did, I feathered number 1 engine. And I don't recall his exact words, but what he said in effect was, well, I've been expecting you to have a little engine trouble, have a good trip home. And so we peeled out of formation and came back across the English Channel about 20 feet high, and across southern part of England up to our base at perhaps 30 feet off the ground. We were scaring old farmers.
Okay, you're flying back on 2 engines and about 30 feet off the deck, and
We left you where we were coming home from a supply dropping raid to the guerrillas in southern France and in Spain. And since that was our last mission, the 30th mission, and we knew that we were going to get back all right, I called the group leader and told him that we had to feather one because we were overheating, and he kind of grinned on the radio and said, I understand, I expected you to. So I feathered number 1, and we came home. We dropped out of formation and came back across the English Channel about, well, I'd say 20 feet, it might have been 100. And then we came back across England at a very, very low altitude. And we were going over farms and scaring farmers off their tractors and scaring horses and cows and scaring me a little bit. And we got back to base and we buzzed the control tower, and they knew what was going on. And we landed, and there was another crew. Winton G. Ramsey was a pilot. Very, very fine young man. He was killed on his, he went back for a second tour and he was killed later. But his crew finished at the same time, so we were both in the 561st Squadron of the 388th Bomb Group. And he had been on that Russian raid. And we were debriefed and went through our donut and tot of rum routine after a mission, and went back to the squadron headquarters, and we had a little lawn out in front of the squadron, about, I don't know, 10 feet by 10 feet square, something like that, a little grass patch. And so we all went and got all this crazy kind of booze that we had been buying for the last 15 or 20 missions, when we began to believe we might finish and actually survive. And everybody brought out these concoctions that we had, and we drank it. And one by one, and this is a true story, one by one, the guys would either get sick or pass out. And the other crews that weren't finished yet were observing all this, of course, in a big circle and laughing and clapping and having a great time. Very happy for us. It was quite a thing to finish. Losses were very high. And to finish 30 raids, literally unscathed, other than a few nicks from shrapnel, it was quite amazing. So they would carry the guys into their barracks, the enlisted men in one barracks and the officers in another barracks, and I don't know who carried me in, but somebody did. And that was all over. The group had been chosen to experiment with a kamikaze B-17. Now what was planned at that stage in the war, and this was either late August or early September 1944, they would load a B-17 with high explosives, and it would be equipped so that it could be radio controlled. The pilot would take it off and set it up, trim it up at about 4,000 or 5,000 foot of altitude, and then snap on the radio control, and a fighter escort airplane, normally a Mosquito, a twin-engine British machine, would fly in formation and control the B-17 by radio. And it, going across the channel, and the pilot would bail out, and air-sea rescue would pluck him out of the channel, and the Mosquito would fly the B-17 into whatever target they wanted to dive that B-17 in. And so we experimented with that. I volunteered for that and flew maybe 2 or 3 practice raids. We never bailed out, but we would try to get the radio control working. And for some reason, either political or strategic or financial, I don't know which, that program was abandoned. So the officers, not the enlisted men, but the officers were all asked if they would volunteer for another 20 missions. And we all said, certainly. We said yes, we would. So we all signed up for another 20 missions, and for that we got 30 days rest and recuperation in the States. And I flew home. I was flown to Wales, and I was put on a, I guess it was a DC-6. I thought it was a DC-4, a C-54, C-56, and was flown to Reykjavik, Iceland, and then to Presque Isle, Maine, and then to New Jersey. And it was in New Jersey where I had my first hamburger. And I had hamburgers and Cokes in New Jersey. And we waited around for the match flights, we, the other guys that were coming home. My crew had all gone to the Four Winds by then. And I flew home in a C-47 that made several stops. I called my wife Kathy in Florida, and I was on the way to Hamilton Field in California. I had to report there. That was my duty station while I was on, no, it wasn't, I beg your pardon, it was March Field in Riverside, California. And I had to report there while I was on rest and recuperation. So Kathy came out on a train to meet me, and I went to March Field and was then assigned, given a ticket to San Diego, which was my home base. And I met my folks, and Kathy came out, and we had a nice 30-day visit, and it was all very nice. I went back to New Jersey to report for my next 20 missions, and Kathy went with me, Atlantic City, New Jersey. And at that point, they found albumin in my urine during my going overseas physical. And that's an indication of Bright's disease, or cancer of the kidney. So they said, well, you can't go overseas yet till we find out what that is. So I went to the hospital in Nashville, Tennessee, and they fussed around and determined that it was just because I was skinny and had lost some weight overseas, and my kidneys were complaining, and they excreted this stuff, whatever it is. So they fattened me up, and I was in a Army Air Force hospital, and I had my choice of a glass of wine or a glass of beer every night for dinner. That wasn't all bad. So after that, I was sent to instructor school in Columbus, Ohio. I became a B-17 instructor pilot and went to Sebring, Florida, where I instructed in transition, and then sent to Avon Park, Florida, where I instructed in operational training, or formation flying and bombing and air-to-air gunnery and that sort of thing.
What's transition?
That's where you transition. Transition flying means you're transitioning from one kind of an airplane to another. And most of the students that we had just come out of multi-engine advanced flying school, twin-engine aircraft, and they were moving up or transitioning up to 4-engine aircraft, which was the B-17. About that time, the war in Europe ended, and the war in Asia, in war with Japan, was moving on apace. And I brought a troop train. I was a commander of a troop train going taking a lot of folks from Florida to the West Coast to go to the Pacific Theater. I had about 400 plus people, a couple of first sergeants to take care of the detail, and I wandered around trying to look important. I didn't know what in the world I was doing. And when we stopped in New Orleans to load fuel oil on the engine, VE Day was declared. Now, and that's a true story. I had given everybody a 4-hour pass to leave the train and run around New Orleans and come back at whatever the 4th hour was. And then we'd go on to California. And in the middle of that 4-hour period was VE Day. I don't recall how long we were there or how many people we never did find, but we found most of them and got them herded back on the train, and we went on to California, and I turned over my troops at Marchfield and then went back to Avon Park, Florida, just before a hurricane, and we had to fly the B-17s out. We flew to Deming, New Mexico, then it went back to Avon Park, and I was ultimately discharged at Avon Park, Florida, and went back to work for the telephone company as a lineman. The military experience in World War II was very interesting. It was a popular war, very well supported by the public. There were no murderers, and there were no bums. We were all heroes, whether we wanted to be or not. And it was quite an experience for a young man. I was competing with college grads when I went through the training, and I did a lot of studying under the blankets with a flashlight to try to get through, but it all worked out. But you learn a lot about yourself in a combat situation. And I learned a lot about myself, and I don't really regret any of it. Of course, we all went to war to make the world safe for our children so they wouldn't have to go to war. It didn't work out that way, but I came home and went back to work for the phone company. My time was bridge, my service was bridge. Promoted to foreman in March of 1947, I believe it was. And volunteered for active duty in the Korean War, flew for MAPS in the Korean War. Was sent to Mountain Home, Idaho. I wanted to fly B-29s, but I didn't get to. I flew C-47s and SA-16s and C-119s and C-46s and C-47s and DC-4s and DC-6s, a little bit of each, but mostly in communications. Went back to the phone company and moved around. My children were coming along then. We had 3, Jim, John, and Jeff, and that was a marvelous experience. We had a wonderful dog, old Major, an old collie. He would, when I would pound on John out in the backyard, spank John for some real or perceived violation of my rules, Major would get a hold of the seat of my pants and pull me away from him. And I remember when Jimmy was going to down to the school bus, Major would go with him on the traffic side. Jimmy on the gutter side with no curb and sidewalk. And on the way back from the school, Major would go down as soon as he found out when the school bus came every day. He'd go down, meet the bus, and he'd come home and he'd walk on the traffic side of Jimmy. We built our own little home in Lemon Grove. It was a 780 square foot home, 1 bedroom.
What was the address?
Pardon me?
What was the address? Remember what the address was?
It was 120 East Mount Vernon in Lemon Grove, right across the street from Miller's Dairy. Very aromatic neighborhood. A very nice neighborhood. We had a grand time there. It took 3.5 years to build that house. It cost, I think the material for the house cost around $1,100. I bought a half acre for $1,000, and another half acre behind us. We had an L-shaped acre for $1,000, so we had $3,100 in the house, and it took me, as I said, 3.5 to 4 years to finally complete it. And we did everything ourselves, and we sold it. As I recall, it was around $11,500 we got for the property and the house. and then we built a bigger place out in Spring Valley. Did part of that ourselves. We transferred to Los Angeles with the telephone company. I was promoted. We were in Los Angeles, lived in Pico Rivera for about a year. Went back to the house in Spring Valley. Then I was transferred then to Los Angeles again, and we bought a house in Arcadia. We sold a house in Spring Valley. Lived there for several years, and I was transferred. We were divorced at that time while we lived in Arcadia on East Los Flores, I think it was.
159. Yeah.
And we were divorced then. Then later I remarried. I was transferred to San Francisco. Before I left, I was promoted from district manager to division manager to assistant vice president and general sales manager in Pasadena. And then moved to San Francisco. We lived in Walnut Creek. And I became a regulatory AVP and was later transferred to Sacramento as a general manager working for Glenn Ziegler, and had 3 marvelous children with the second marriage, Jason, Jill, and Jan. Worked in San Francisco for 5 years while we lived in Walnut Creek. Then was transferred to Sacramento as a general manager. Worked here for, let's see, 14 years, and moved from general manager to area vice president, and then retired from the company in '87 as the area vice president. Had a tremendous retirement party. That was quite a bash. That's a story all by itself.
What was with the J thing with all the kids? What was the deal behind all that?
What was the what?
Jim, John, Jeff, Jason, Jill, and Jan. What was the J deal?
Well, my dad was James Paul Phillips, J.P. Phillips. And so the J thing got very popular in World War II. And in fact, Catherine knew me as Jim. My ball tour gunner was Jim Pisaki. My middle name is James, Norman James Phillips. So I became Big Jim, and he became Little Jim. So Catherine and I both thought it would be nice to have our children have names that began with a J. So it was Norman James Phillips II, John Beatty Phillips, Beatty from her father's name, and Jeffrey Scott Phillips. Scott because Randolph Scott was a movie star that I very much admired. So it was Jim, John, and Jeff, and then Jason and Jill and Jan. And that was stemmed from my father's name, James Paul.
What about your parents' parents? What do you know about them?
I know very little about my parents' families. My father was born in Manayunk, Pennsylvania. His father was a carriage operator, carriage driver, horse and carriage, and a gatekeeper for a very wealthy family in Manayunk, which is now part of Philadelphia. And there was apparently very little love in the family. My father left home in his very, very early teens, and went to work. And we don't know much about that side of the family. My mother was born very shortly after her parents got here from Sweden. She's one of 4 girls in the Anderson family, Geneva Amelia Anderson. Her mother died while the girls were very young, and her father raised them, and he was quite a disciplinarian, quite a tough fellow, very little love. There was Aunt May, Aunt Agnes, Aunt Nellie, and Mother, Geneva Amelia. They were all very close, and we stayed close all through the years until they ultimately passed away. But Mom had a very tough childhood. When she and Dad were married, he did sharecropping, and she was born in Stillwater, Minnesota, and he was a sharecropper share farmer in Butte, Montana. And I remember one winter he told me about where it would get to 60 below, and their little ramshackle house out on a prairie where he was growing wheat, winter wheat and summer wheat, was up on stilts. The cheapest way to build it. And to keep the family from freezing to death, and a lot of horses, because you farmed with horses, Dad would stack up horse manure around the house, up above those 4x4s it was sitting on, and it would freeze, of course, and that would keep the wind from blowing under the house and up through the floorboard. So it was very tough. It was very tough. And they kept on that kind of an existence until he ultimately got a job with the Great Northern Railroad, which is when I came along.
You know anything about your grandparents?
No, I know nothing about my grandparents on either side. I don't even know their names. I can't, other than my mother's birth certificate, I can get her father's name from that. But we know nothing about my father's side of the family. My older brother Bud, during World War II, when he was in the Navy, went to Manayunk and found the Phillipses, or some part of the Phillips family, and they weren't at all glad to see him. I don't know whether there was an inheritance they thought he was trying to steal or what, but they didn't make him feel welcome at all, so we never pursued that at all. I have no idea who they are, and frankly don't care to pursue it.
How'd you get your first car?
That was interesting. When I was very, very young, and I mean very young, in the 6, 7, 8 range, we lived on Auburn Drive in East San Diego. That's just south of University, just east of Euclid Avenue. And my older brother, Bud, who was 10 years older than I, that would make him 17 or 18, joined the Navy. Jobs were very, very scarce then. This would be 1936 or so. No.
Be 28, 29.
26. It would be, 1930. I would be 8, I was born in 22, that would make it 1930, so Bud would be 17 or 18. And he was in the Navy, and I wanted to buy a car. And I found an old Model T I could get for $5. So I wrote a letter to my brother Bud, and he sent me $5, and I bought the Model T, and Dad towed it home for me in the backyard. I took it all apart, and Dad helped me put it back together. Several months elapsed here, and we actually got it to run. And I sold the car, and I've forgotten what I got for it. I think it was around $10. And Dad had to tow it over to the other party's house. But Bud always got a big kick out of that. He, every time we had a little family reunion, he'd remind me that he bought me my first automobile. And indeed he did. But we had a grand time with that. It's interesting to go back and relive many of the things you did. I bought my second or third car, I've forgotten now which. It was a Model A pickup truck. I paid $44 for it. I bought it from a used car lot on El Cajon Boulevard near Copeland Avenue in East San Diego. I had a paper route. And I made a deal with the fellow that I bought it from. I would haul, he needed some dirt in his yard, so I would haul dirt in his yard at $1 a load until I paid for the truck. And so I did. I'd go steal dirt from the county or out in the county property near riverbanks and whatnot.
We'll have to edit that part, yeah.
Pardon me?
We'll have to edit that part out. So.
Yes, okay. But I did. I stole the dirt and hauled dirt for him and ultimately paid for the car that way. I tore up several rear ends. There's a ring and pinion gear in a Model A that aren't very substantial. And I got pretty good at replacing the ring and pinion gear in that old bucket. But we had a grand time with that. I had 17 citations, traffic citations of one kind or another that my poor dear mother had to appear with me for things like no tail light, no windshield, driving on the wrong side of the street, illegal parking, speeding, reckless driving, all that sort of thing. 17 citations, and I never did lose my license.
Boy, I wish I'd have known that when I got my first speeding ticket. You had to go with me.
But it was a grand experience.
What do you remember about Uncle Les?
Brother Les, who was 5 years older than I think he was really my hero. He was the kindest, gentlest, most loving man. Very good with his hands. When we lived on 44th Street, he worked at Shorty's service station in the southwest corner of Euclid and El Cajon Boulevard. I don't know what he was making, but it couldn't have been over $3 or $4 a week. I had a yen for the little Tootsie toy cars, the little lead trucks and trailers that you could get for 15 cents a piece or whatever they were. And Les, at that age, now he would have been 15 maybe, I would have been around 10. And he gave me a 25 cents a week allowance out of his $3 or $4 a week that he earned. That's kind of a guy he was. He helped me when I built our first home there in Lemon Grove. He was just an absolute marvel. Painted for the Union Ice Company. His wife left him and ran off with a sailor that was discharged from the Navy, and they went back east. He loved her very much. That destroyed him. And she would keep calling him and telling him that, well, I'm going to come back. I can't stand this anymore. And he'd wait for her, and then she'd say, no, I'm not. So he finally killed himself. He couldn't stand that torment anymore. But he was a marvelous guy. My sister Dorothy was a sweet, sweet person. She had a bad marriage to Don Adams, but they had a beautiful daughter, my niece, Pat. Dorothy used to take care of me. I remember one incident when we lived on 46th Street. I believe it was just south of University. That Dorothy and Les and some more of their friends were going to the beach. Now Dorothy would be 8 years older than I, so I must have been maybe 8 or 9. And Mom said, no, you can't go. And she didn't want me to interfere with the older children's fun. And Dorothy said, no, let him come along. I'll watch him. So I got to go to the beach because of my sister's care and concern for me.
How old did your dad live to be?
Pardon me?
How old did your dad live to be?
Dad died when he was 66. He had cancer. He retired at 65, and he lived on retirement 1 year. I was in the Korean War then. No, I'm not saying that right. Yes. Yes, I was. And I flew home to see him once. And then when I got out of the Korean War, we drove down to see him, and I was with him when he died.
What year was that?
'52. Korea was over. Korean War was 51 and 52. That would have been 52. But he had he didn't suffer. He just went to sleep and died. And the little church up on 41st and University, the people that were just overflowing. People out on the sidewalk. He had a grand going away, grand sending away.
How did Mom's dad die? My other grandfather.
My mother's father?
My mom's dad. Yeah, I remember you guys had to go back east for his funeral back in
Well,
59 or 60.
that was unfortunate. He was almost blind, as you may recall. Had one glass eye, cataract in the other eye. C.J. Beatty, just the greatest guy in the world. He was my good friend. We were real pals. We used to go down to Florida to see him when he lived there, and then he got to where it wasn't too smart to let him live alone. So he came to California and moved in with us.
I remember that.
Spring
Yeah,
Valley.
I remember. All
And
three.
we had just a great time. He didn't. Your mother and C.J. didn't get along too well there for a little while. So Uncle Willis thought maybe it'd be better if he went back to Florida and stayed with Marge and Willis. So Willis came out to pick him up, and we had a very emotional goodbye. And he went back home and moved out on the farm with Willis and Marge, and I don't know what went through his mind, but it wasn't very pleasant for him, and he hung himself in a tree out in Willis's backyard, and Willis cut him down, and then of course the sheriff came and they had to find out what took place, and what did Willis hang him, or what really did happen. So that was a very terrible experience for all the children. He was just a great guy, a really great guy. But that's, those are part of the memories.
When we used to go up to Uncle Jerry and Annie's, did we drive up, was it 101? Was that the main road out of LA or San Diego?
Yes, we would come up Highway 101. We would leave either San Diego or Arcadia, wherever we happened to live at the time.
Well, we had the Chevy in San Diego.
We came up 99 most of the time, which came up through Bakersfield and Manteca and Fresno and Lodi.
It goes through Marysville too, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And then we turn off at Lodi and come along the river road and come into Napa the back way. Because we did that frequently. We had a lot of trips to Napa. I really enjoyed that. Jerry and Edith they had that big 12-acre farm there. An old farmhouse.
It's 10 acres, I think.
Used to raise chickens, and they had a cow at one time. But that was kind of like going out to the country to visit Uncle Jerry and Aunt Edith on a farm, and they were always glad to see us. We had a great time there. We had a grand visit every time. Many times we drove up there from San Diego and from Los Angeles. Ran out of gas one time. We had a little Chevy Nomad station wagon.
Yeah, I remember that night. I remember.
And I walked, oh boy, it was walking.
It's like 1 or 2 in the morning or something like that.
And I walked, I don't know how many miles to get gas and got a ride back. But it was a little scary for your mother and the children in that car there while I was going. But those were good times. Those were good times. I remember one time Jimmy set that little compost box out in the backyard in Lemon Grove, and with little scrap lumber by it, and he set that on fire. And the local fire department there in Lemon Grove had to come put that out. Your mother felt so good about that, she baked her a cake later and took it up.
Well, Lou and I started that fire out on where the Lefevre's house is, when it was a vacant lot.
Yeah.
And everybody was up, the neighborhood was up there, the fire department. We were the only two that wasn't there. So everybody figured out real quick who.
And you remember when you got stuck in a hole?
Oh yeah, I was talking to Tommy and Martha about a month ago about that. They poured big concrete posts into the ground. I guess the holes were, I don't know, maybe 4 feet deep and just big enough around for me to fall in one and sit on my knees, and it was over my head, so I was yelling, but you couldn't hear it because I was underground.
And you couldn't get out because you couldn't straighten yourself out.
That
was a terrible experience. I remember that.
When did you guys start looking for me, or what?
Oh, you'd been in there quite a little while.
Yeah.
Couldn't find you, so I think I was on the way down to Overtrice's house. See if Lou knew where you were. And then I heard you.
Oh, you did?
Got close enough to the hole.
I remember you pulling me out.
Yeah, that was quite an experience. I don't know where Major was all that time.
I don't know. I just remember. I felt like I was 100 miles under. Couldn't have been that old. And then we had that trailer, that wooden trailer. We painted white, put blue polka dots on it. Remember that? And that was after Lou and I started the fire, and it was full of stuff, and spontaneously a fire started. And man, I had to explain myself, where I was, what I was doing, that I didn't do it, I didn't do it.
Oh, that was a good trailer. It was an old ice truck body.
Oh, is that what it was?
Yeah, Uncle Les got that for us from Union Ice Company. Well built, out of oak. It had those iron brackets on the side, you remember?
Mm-hmm.
Boy, we towed that all over the country. We towed that to Florida 2 or 3 times. We towed it to Mountain Home, Idaho. Major used to ride in a trailer.
Oh, yeah.
And when it was warm during the day, I'd stop and get a 25-pound block of ice and put it in the trailer. He'd curl up around that block of ice.
Oh, just to keep them cool?
Yeah. Yeah, we drove cross country with that trailer several times. Several times.
Building the tree house, remember building the tree house?
Oh boy, do I.
The tree.
Yeah, we set redwood.
The condo wasn't a tree house.
We set redwood telephone poles, square poles. In the ground. They were about 8 by 8 or 10 by 10.
Yeah, they're good size.
And then we built a platform around that, and then framed a little. It was probably 6 by 6 or 8. No, must have been 8 by 8 feet square. And between these posts, then we put dowels, or broom handles across, so you had a ladder to get up through the crawl hole.
No, there was one post, one pole in the middle, and you put telephone.
Oh, was it steps on that
Yeah,
one?
you put steps on it.
No, I was thinking of the other treehouse I built later on then. But then I do remember splitting redwood posts for the shingles on the roof.
I remember
I still
that,
have a piece of steel in my leg where the hatchet I was using flaked off and a hunk of steel went in my leg. That's somewhere in there. But that was a well-built little treehouse.
Oh, it was great. Yeah, we had mud ball fights. You know, and whoever was on the inside of the tree house, once they ran out of mud balls, they were screwed.
Then we bought an old car.
Was it from John May for $5? That thing that we put up. It had a crack block. We put it.
I wanted you children to have the same experience I had. Take an old car apart.
It seems to me I remember it different.
Well, it turned out different. We towed that thing up to the house and then finally coaxed it into the backyard between the garage and the wall I'd built.
Oh, did it get that way? Okay.
Yep. And put it in the backyard, and you kids took hammers and rocks and
took a digging bar and ran it through both doors, I think.
Broke all the windows and busted out the headlights, and we had finally had to get somebody to come and haul it away.
Remember when the DeSoto we had, you had it parked in the back, I think it was facing east, and I climbed up in there, I don't know, it couldn't have been more than 3 or 4, and it was in gear, and the keys were in it, and I turned it on, and it went lunging forward and knocked the fence down. Remember that?
No.
Yeah. It's the first time yeah.
Who's that?
Sorry. I had to just come.
Come here, honey, I want you to meet some people.
Oh.
Just sit right here.
Okay.
And this is my daughter, Jan, and this is why I come home from work every night, just so I can see this beautiful girl. She's 19. She works at Round Table Pizza, been there for 2 years, about to become a manager. And that's a camera. John's recording this for posterity.
Recording it for who?
Posterity. It's a guy that lives down the street.
I know, I didn't mean that. I meant.
Are you?
Yeah.
No, yeah, you better not. You home for the evening?
No.
Okay.
Are you right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Oh, I'm sorry, I just said.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
See you later, man. Glad you came by to get into film.
Okay.
You better not me. See you later.
Quit making him cry. My hug him when we go.
Hug, another hug. God, I give you a hug last
I love
week.
you.
You too.
Are you warm?
Yeah. Really.
Memories.
Well, when you try to
Yeah.
recount the memorable years, by memorable years, I mean if you go back to your first recollection and you try to recount the incidents that influenced you to do the things you did, whether it was, in my case, the excitement of being able to fly and the glamour and the patriotism of going to a popular war, the stability and worthwhileness of a marriage and a family, the anchor that's provided your children by a home where they can call a home and they know they have a mom and dad that loves them, the opportunity to work for a company that will allow you to progress as you are capable of progressing. I don't know that that's possible anymore. It was possible in my day. And I enjoyed working for my company. I've worked for them for 48 years altogether, counting 2 years as a contract employee. And I remain very proud of the telephone company.
Contract employee? When was that? I didn't know about that.
When I had the telephone pioneer job.
Oh, okay.
46 years active and 2 years contract. But when I started, we had belt system practices. I guess they still do.
BSPs.
The BSPs, and we had the G10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and 60 series. G10 301S was the state law for clearances, and that's where we had to follow that practice to keep separations between our grounded plant and the electrical plant on joint poles, where we had both telephone plant and electrical conductors on the same pole. And G20 was the pole line series, and so on. The one practice that I recall instructed us in how many quarts of oats to feed a mule a day when he was working. And we pulled a lot of open wire in those days. We didn't have cable when I started. And we'd pull a lot of open wire, and you'd pull running boards. You could pull two groups or 4 wires on each running board. And you'd pull that with a mule. And the mule would get out with a long rope. And we'd hook it up to his harness. We'd pull past the pole. Then you'd put these running boards up on the cross arms, put the wires up, and then you'd run the mule out some more. We had one mule. We were doing a job putting in 2 groups on the San Diego El Centro toll lead, open wire lead. And there was a young fellow by the name of Stan. Sorry, I've forgotten his last name. Stan was a very quiet kid, very serious young man. I'll think of his name in a moment. And he took care of Bill, the old mule. And Stan never lost his temper, never heard him swear, except when he was in the heavy brush with Bill, trying to get Bill to pull this open wire under the pole line. And Stan would swear at Bill like you wouldn't believe. It would warm your heart to hear Stan talking to old Bill. But we had a practice to follow, and we knew how many quarts of oats to feed old Bill every day to get him to do his job. The company didn't own Bill. We rented the mule, as we rented a lot of equipment from the farmers up in the hills in those days, as we worked in the backcountry. We built one pole line going down Mountain Springs Grade, and that goes from Acumba down to El Centro in East San Diego County. And that's a unique piece of geography. There's no dirt. There's no sand. There's just rocks. Little rocks and big rocks. And when you want to set a pole, you'd carry them in, push them up by hand with pike poles. You'd hold it straight up and down with pike poles. You'd set the butt of the pole in a crevice between rocks. Then you would go gather boulders and pile around that pole 3 or 4 feet high until it wouldn't move. And that's where you set poles all the way down that hill. We used to have a phenomenon called a sympathetic resonant oscillation. Now, if you may have read in your history book about soldiers marching across a bridge. You never go across a bridge in step, that is, left, right, all together. You go across a bridge, wooden bridges, and concrete bridges, in route steps. That is, everybody taking a step at a different time. Because if you all take a step at the same time, that mass of the bridge will move an infinitesimal amount. And its memory brings it back. And then the next step goes down and you depress it a little farther. And you get a sympathetic oscillation there that gets worse and worse. That same thing happens to cable that's strung between poles. If the span lengths are even, for example, 150 poles are 150 feet apart, and a wind starts blowing across that cable lead, one span of cable will begin to swing a little bit with the wind, and the other span will swing a little differently with the wind. And they begin to complement each other. And as the wind increases and the cable begins to oscillate in sympathy, you tear the pole line down. We've had 10, 15, 20, 25 miles of pole line blow over just that way. So we came up with the idea of putting a weight at a different distance out in each span. A third of the span here, half span there, quarter of a span there. 50 to 75 pound concrete weights hanging on the supporting cable strand. And that dampened, that's what they were called, dampeners, and that dampened the oscillation. But I've spent months and months and months in Imperial Valley, in East San Diego County, rebuilding pole lines that had blown down for just that reason.
Have you seen those like triangular shaped pieces of metal that are bent over?
That's the current version of a dampener.
Same thing?
Yes.
I had one guy ask me that was, I forget who it was, somebody's boyfriend or husband or something. He asked me if those concrete weights were to stretch the cable out.
Well, it's hard to understand what the purpose is if you don't have the experience.
Well, I go out and look at land. The realtors that always tell me, "Oh yeah, the phone lines are in." They'd look up and it's a power lead. You know, a lot of times in movies, it's they'll shoot a power line, then the phones will go out. You know, because that was supposed to be the phone line. They never get it right.
Yeah, it's interesting. I watched one movie one time. Oh, it was back in the 1800s, in the 19th century. And these cowboys were all rushing up to the saloon to do some dreadful deed. And right out in front of the saloon was this lash cable with one of the latest version terminals on it, and the pole was stepped, and the down guy had a guy guard on it. It ruined the whole movie. Well, that's a quick pass-through life. I remember when we lived on Los Flores in Arcadia, I went up to Jeff's bedroom one night, and Major was under the covers at the foot of his bed. And I asked, you could see him, of course, and I asked Jeff the bump in the bedclothes, and I asked Jeff, "Is Major in here?" He said, "No, Dad." And Major wagged his tail, and the covers bumped up and down, so I just turned around and walked out.
Yeah, I went in there one night. He was I don't know, he was probably, I don't know, 8 or 9, maybe 10. And he had these horrible nightmares. And he woke up real early one morning with a nightmare, and he was just panicking. And I gave him a pencil or a pen or something. I said, "Hold on to this magic pencil and you won't have any more nightmares. You'll be okay, you'll be safe." And he grabbed onto that thing like it was made out of gold.
Oh, boy.
And he went back to sleep, and he was all right.
Oh, good. Well, that's great.
When you lived on Auburn, you remember what the address was on Auburn?
No. No, I don't.
38th Street was the other one, wasn't it? Was it 38th or 40th?
Oh, goodness. We lived on, when we first moved to San Diego, we lived on 39th. And I think we came from Redondo Beach. And we rented, and we moved at least once every 15 or 18 months.
Where Grandma lived the last.
That was on 44th.
44th?
Well, 41st, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I finally found it. I drove up and down
Is that
41st
right?
and found it. You know, it's changed a lot. But still,
No, we lived on 41st, on 44th, on 46th, on 39th, on Euclid. We lived on 54th.
Auburn.
On Auburn, and I just can't recall all of them. I remember I would be 14, that would be 36. We must have lived on 46th Street at the time. We bought our groceries at Tom Foster's grocery store on Landis and Euclid, which was 2 blocks south of University. Tom had a Model A pickup, a very early Model A with the 3 pedals. I'm sorry, Model T, with a little pickup box in the back. And he hired me. I worked for Tom for quite a long time. One of my proudest moments, he used to buy cheese in those big round circles about that thick. And my job was to cut 1 pound slices out of that cheese and wrap them up, and he'd sell the cheese, put it in his little ice box. And I got pretty good at that. I could come pretty close. We sold cookies then. You didn't have cookies in packages. They came in cardboard boxes about that square and that deep and had an isinglass top. And there was a metal frame that you'd put all these in, so they were at about 45 degrees to the perpendicular.
What's isinglass? What is that?
Kind of a thick cellophane.
Oh.
And it had a lid, so you could open that lid and you'd reach out and put the cookies in the bag, and you could weigh them and however many cookies you wanted. And there'd be 3, 6, 9 boxes of cookies in here. So I used to bag cookies. And I used to put the canned goods away. And people would come in, ladies would walk in. There weren't very many cars then. And they would walk in and they would order their groceries, and they'd get all this stuff, and I'd have 8 or 10 bags of groceries, and I'd put in the back end of this Model A, and then I'd take their groceries home to them. They'd go on home, and then late in the afternoon, last thing I did was deliver groceries. So I drove that Model A all over East San Diego there delivering groceries.
What was that, his store? Where was the store?
What was it?
Where was it?
It was on the northwest corner of Landis or Dwight and Euclid, south of University in East San Diego.
That's right about where that PSA jet went down. I think it was 1980.
Was it?
Right around Landis Street, yeah. Not too far from your mom's house.
But old Tom was real good to me. He was a slow-talking old boy, but I worked real hard. I don't remember how much I made. I remember we charged our groceries there, and Mom paid him every Saturday night when Dad got paid. And whenever you paid your grocery bill, then you got a bag of cellophane bag of candy. And we used to get that candy corn.
Oh, yeah.
And gumdrops.
Uh-huh.
Mom would get a bag of candy for paying the bill, and we'd go home and we'd eat candy. I can remember riding with Dad on the truck, and we would stop at the Montana Inn in Carlsbad, which is north of San Diego. We'd get up around 1 or 2 in the morning. We'd go down to the cook place. He worked for I forgot the name of the company, but it was a freight company. They hauled a lot of freight. And we'd go get the truck, and we'd head for Riverside to get cement. We would, he'd want to stop and have coffee about Carlsbad, which was maybe 25 miles north of San Diego, at the Montana Inn. That was on Highway 101. And I'd always have a hamburger. And the old gentleman that had the Montana Inn, the cook in there, wasn't very busy that time of the morning. As you might imagine, that'd be about 3 in the morning or 3:30. And he made me some wonderful hamburgers. Boy, I'll tell you, he was, I'll never forget the Montana Inn and their hamburgers.
How old were you then?
Oh, goodness, I began riding with Dad on the truck when I was about 6 and rode until I was probably 15 or 16. So that would be, I might have been, well, they were pneumatic tires then, they were not hard rubber tires, so it would be, I was probably 10 or 12.
Were there? I've seen old ads for tires about blowouts. Were blowouts a big deal back then?
Oh yes.
Tire would just explode and that'd be it.
Well, because of the quality of the tire and the inner tube. The tires had inner tubes in, and on truck tires, the inner tubes had real thick walls, real thick rubber for the inner tube. The inner tube probably as strong as a tire. But we changed tires a lot on that truck. We carried 2 spares, one on the trailer and one on the truck. Hauled a lot of cement, hauled a lot of White King soap, hauled a lot of Lever Brothers products, which were soap and cleaners at that time.
Who was Grandpa working for then?
He was with Ted Brown, was the name of the trucking company. Brown Trucking. Ted Brown had the company. He'd bid on jobs. He did the bidding, and he had several trucks and trailers. And Dad worked for him. Then he went to work for Glass and Lumber Company, and he drove the first 3-axle autocar semi in San Diego County. Big, beautiful truck. And they painted his name on the door, and he had big air horns on the roof of the truck.
Yeah, about 1978, right in there. I almost bought an autocar.
Really?
Yeah, for hauling hay. When I was hauling hay for a while, I was going to buy one and just drive it by myself. It was an old yellow autocar.
I remember an incident with Brother Les. When I came back from World War II, I stayed in the reserve for a while, and we had a reserve unit down at Lindbergh Field. We had a C-47, and we had a couple of SNJs or AT-6s. That was a North American trainer, single-engine trainer, 600 horsepower, 2-seater. That's the one they dress up as a Zero in some of the war movies they've made. They paint circles on the side, and it looks a little bit like a Zero. Jimmy Curtis and I, who was my buddy that I went in the Korean War with and in World War II with, we'd go down to Lindbergh Field on the weekends and we'd fly those AT-6s. And we'd get up and have all kinds of fun in those things. And Les wanted to go up one time. So I took my brother Les down. He got the back seat and I got the front seat. That's a military airplane. They're not built for comfort, you know. This is raw metal and a lot of rivets showing and all that sort of thing. So we flew around San Diego, and I took him out over Lemon Grove, and I was circling his house, and he never did find his house. He could never get over the absolute thrill and the disorientation that comes from not having your feet on solid ground.
First time he'd ever flown?
First time he'd ever been up in the air, yeah. And we circled that house of his till I was getting a little dizzy. But he really enjoyed that ride. But Jimmy and I used to have a lot of fun with those AT-6s.
What were some of the fighters they used in the Pacific? Do you remember, besides the, what the heck was it? It was a low-wing fighter, kind of squared off at the ends of the wings. I can't remember. I just keep seeing it in documentaries, but I can't remember.
In World War II?
Yeah.
The Corsair, the Vought Corsair, was very popular in the South Pacific, and that's where this, they did a TV series on that.
Yeah, I remember that. That's not the one I'm thinking of, though.
They also flew the P-47, which was a radial engine. It looked like a pickle barrel. It was a big, fat fuselage with a short wing and a small tail.
P-40s, too, didn't they?
What?
Did they fly the P-40s and P-39s?
They flew the P-40s and the P-39s early in the war. Very early in the war. And during the war, they flew a lot of the P-38s and some P-51s in the South Pacific.
Well, these were aircraft carriers. These were Navy planes, but I just can't remember the name of it.
Well, there was the F-4.
Something with a D.
And the F-6, the Hellcat, the Tomcat and the Hellcat. They were stubby. They were very, very popular carrier aircraft.
Maybe it was the Tomcat.
No, it was a Wildcat, I'm sorry. Wildcat and the Hellcat. But later on in the war, the 38 and the 47 and the Corsair were the big numbers in the South Pacific.
38 was the twin fuselage.
Yep.
Right.
The Lightning.
They used the B-25 quite a bit. I know that they had that raid, what was it, Doolittle had that raid on Tokyo, and they had to launch from an aircraft carrier, and it was, I think, within 500 feet they had to be off the ground, and it was a big deal. Nobody thought they could do it.
A friend of mine was on that raid. they came upon a fishing boat, a Japanese fishing boat, which they immediately blew up and destroyed. But they thought the fishing boat had sent a radio alarm back to Japan, so they had to take off earlier than they thought. And that's why so many of them didn't. Well, they all went down. But they would have had enough fuel to get to their intended landing field deep in China if they had not had to take off that early.
That early?
Well, they had to take off before they wanted to, and they had to fly longer to get to Tokyo.
Oh, because they were on the carrier and the guys. Oh, okay.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember they ran out of fuel and they had to ditch a lot.
Yeah.
All of them, I guess.
Griff Williams was the fellow that I knew. He was Phyllis Williams' brother, and Phyllis married Earl Lind, a buddy of mine. We were paper boys together. So that's how I got to know Griff Williams, or got to know of him.
What was the public sentiment when they dropped the bomb?
Oh boy, it brought this country right up on its tiptoes. It really did. That was a great piece of political strategy. It was terrible. We lost a lot of people, but that made Doolittle a general. You know, that's interesting that you mentioned that. When I had the general manager's job here in Sacramento, my boss was the region vice president. Most wonderful man in the world, Glenn Ziegler. And he wanted to run the business. And he wanted me to run my part of the business, but take care of the public relations and public affairs part of it, which was fine. That was fine with me. One of my jobs, I guess you could call it, or responsibilities, was to interface with the various departments at the state capitol. It was the biggest state in the Union, and we're headquartered. My job was to interface with the capital of the largest state in the Union. So one of the Veterans Affairs fellows with the state called me and said, we're going to identify all of the Medal of Honor holders in California and give them a special license plate. And I'll think of his name in a moment. Fine man. He said, would Pacific Bell want to participate? And I said, you bet we would. Because I had several $1,000s every year I could spend on that kind of stuff. Later on, it amounted to between $50,000 and $80,000 a year. We put together, and I worked very closely with him, and a lot of my people did, and we put together a tremendous event here in Sacramento. They identified the 33 or 34 Medal of Honor holders in California still alive, brought them to the state capitol at no expense to them. And Pacific Bell wasn't the only company that participated. Aerojet and Bank of America and PG&E and SMUD and a lot of firms participated. We brought them to the Capitol. They had a big reception on the Capitol steps, and they got their license plates. We had several dinners for them around the Capitol, around Sacramento. I hosted a big dinner at the Red Lion Inn. No, it wasn't the Red Lion Inn, it was the Sacramento Inn. Big dinner. And General Doolittle was there.
Oh, wow.
With his wife. A lot of, I think out of the 36 or 37, all but one or two came, and they were just physically unable to come. So Jill, Lorna and Jill and Jason, I don't think Jan went, I don't think she was old enough. But Jill and Jason, we took them to the dinner with us and took them around and introduced them to some of the Medal of Honor holders. And one of the older Medal of Honor holders, a Mexican American who lived down in Merced, gave Jill his small replica of the Medal of Honor that he got in his box. She still has it.
Wow.
And General Doolittle and his wife were there, and we got to sit and talk with them. That was a very, very moving experience, I'll tell you.
Yeah, I bet.
Very moving.
When I took that ride in that 17, I think the next night or the night after that, 2 nights after that, they had members of the 332nd, you know, fighter, the P-51 escort guys, in a dinner. You could go, you know, for so much money, you could go down and I just spent $400 doing the B-17 stuff, so I didn't have any. But that would have been pretty cool.
Oh boy, I'll say. But that was a very nice event, very nice affair.
Is General Doolittle still alive?
No, he died.
What was his first name?
Jimmy.
Jimmy.
James
Right.
Doolittle. James E. Doolittle, I think it was. And that's the way it goes. You're born, you live, and you die.
Yep.
I mean, you have a lot of fun, a lot of experience in the middle.
Oh, tell the flak helmet. That's pretty.
That was interesting. When I first started flying combat in B-17s, it was in the E model. Now the E model did not have the dorsal fin on the top of the fuselage that ran back and met with the vertical stabilizer. So the fuselage went back like this and then the tail went up. The dorsal fin came like this and went up. And it gave you more lateral stability in the airplane. It also had hydraulic supercharger controls. We had superchargers on each of the 4 engines. And with the hydraulic controls at 60 below zero at 25,000 feet, it was awfully hard to get them in sync so that each engine was pulling the same and you worked your buns off. It was a lot of work. Then the F model came out with electronic or electric supercharger controls, a little knob, and it had the dorsal fin, and you had armor plate on the side of the pilot and the side of the co-pilot, so the flak wouldn't come through and tear your middle out. We didn't want, well, you couldn't carry all the armor plate you would have liked to have carried to protect yourself in the front, because there was no place to put the armor plate between you and the nose and the bombardier and the navigator. And you got the big plexiglass nose. So they came out with flak vests and flak helmets. So when you were getting into a dangerous situation, either anti-aircraft fire, flak, or enemy aircraft, you would put on your flak vest and put on your helmet. And one of my jobs was to check with my crew to see, as we moved across the channel, we formed up, and it's an hour and a half or 2.5 hours to form up, flew across the channel. We're getting over enemy territory now. And in the early days, we didn't have fighter escort, so we call the guys and let's check out tail gunner, you know, ball turret gunner, radio man, left waist, right waist. Do you have your flak vest on? Got your flak helmet on? And one of my guys, I think it was Joe Galuli, one of the waist gunners, said, "Skipper, I not only have my flak helmet on, I got everything in it but my feet." And that was a kind of a rapport that you develop with your crew. And that's worth a few comments. We were together maybe 7 months, including training and flying combat. That is 50 years ago. And I'm still in touch with those who are alive. I talked to my navigator, Big Nations, as recent as a month ago. I went to Reno to a reception and met with one of my waist gunners as recent as a year and a half ago. You go through so much in the peaks and valleys of emotion, when you're not sure you're going to make it. 50,000 young men were killed in World War II in B-17. That was well over 25% of those who went out in B-17. When I first arrived at the 388th Bomb Group, we had an idiot operations officer who welcomed the 4 or 5 crews that arrived at the same time. And his welcoming words were, "In 3 months, half of you will be dead." That makes you feel real warm and fuzzy all over, you know. The fact is that the experience brings you so close together that you just don't get over that. Either your crew gets along or they don't, and we happen to get along. Tail gunner was very quiet, Virgil Clausen. After the war, I wrote him a few times, never heard from him. The 2 waist gunners, Benny Brynildson and Joe Gidoli, I still hear from. Top turret gunner Red Schroetz I kept in touch with for probably 20 years, and he finally stopped writing. The navigator Vic Nations I still hear from. Jack Hamilton, the bombardier, I don't know what happened to him. I lost track of him. The other pilot, Stan Hanushak, died. I'm missing one, the radio man. I kept in touch with him for a long time. His name will come to me in a moment. But it's the kind of experience that you just can't have anywhere else. And it brings you so close together that you want to continue the relationship. And for having been exposed to each other for no more than 7 months, and to still be in touch with each other after 50 years, attests to the fact that there was something very special about working with guys that kept their cool and didn't break under that kind of pressure. I remember one raid, I think it was the Roulon raid, where we had so much trouble, and we lost the feathering oil on number 2, and it sprayed out all over the cowling, and it sprayed back over the ball turret and immediately froze. And the ball turret gunner couldn't see out of his little square glass.
The oil froze?
Oil. And the propeller burned off, came back up over the wing, tore a hole in the wing, and then fell off and went down. And the ball turret gunner, Jimmy Paisaki, and those ball turret gunners on the early models were so small you couldn't wear your parachute in there. But here's this little kid, little Jim, hanging down under that B-17 with nothing between him and the ground but space.
I mean, the ball turret got hit or damaged?
Pardon me?
You said the ball turret got damaged or what?
No, it just oil sprayed all over the glass and he couldn't see out.
Oh, okay.
So he called me. He had a little clock on the floor of his ball turret between his feet to tell him whether it was at 12 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 3 o'clock, or 6 o'clock. And he said, "Skipper, tell me where there are, and I'll fire a few bursts at them so they'll see the tracers." Now, he had every right to tip those guns down and come out of that damn ball turret and get out there, get out of it. But he stayed there. That's the kind of relationship that you develop. Benny Brynildson, one of the waist gunners, was Norwegian and spoke with a little bit of an accent and a lot of stuttering. And when Benny got excited,
Yeah.
he stuttered. You couldn't tell what was going on. But when we would when Benny saw some enemy fighters coming in and he tried to tell us where they were, it was just too hilarious to get worried. You know, he couldn't get excited about it. But he'd do his best, and Joe would finally get the message out for us. So we had a good bunch.
Yeah, when you said that the top turret guy, when you guys were testing your guns, the whole deal?
It's interesting how out of a clear blue sky with absolutely no warning, some memory cell will energize itself and remind you of some things that happened in your lifetime. And I hearken back perhaps too much to the B-17 era in my life, partly because that was a tremendous transition for me from delivering newspapers and mowing lawns and climbing poles for the telephone company to flying a 4-engine bomber in a combat experience. And so you remember a lot of things about that, where you might not remember who paid their bill when you were collecting for the San Diego Union, and how much donuts cost when you spent part of your money to buy a milkshake and get a donut. But one of the things that I will always remember is after taking off in a B-17, you get up, you go to breakfast. If you're flying a mission, you get a fresh egg. If you're not flying a mission, you get powdered eggs. And we normally had fried tomatoes and fried fish and boiled potatoes for breakfast, which was all right. They were filling. Then you'd go to briefing, and you'd go in the briefing room, and here's all the pilots and co-pilots sitting there, and the navigators and bombardiers are in their briefing, gunners in their briefing. And they open a big curtain on this big, huge wall, and here's that colored yarn going over to the target and back. And you know it's either a DP, a deep penetration, or it's a shallow, just across the channel and dump and come back home. And then you go out to the airplane and you pre-flight the airplane, talk to the crew chief and find out what he's fixed and hasn't fixed and how many holes are left from the last raid. And you take off and you struggle to get that old bucket off the ground, and then you assemble and you try to find your way around in the dark, and you get up and then the sun comes up. You know, you're flying out, you're crossing the channel, you're getting away from England, so they're in no danger from falling B-17s. And you go into a gunnery check, and that's after you get far enough away from England so that your tail gunner can't fire backwards and hit anybody in England. You check each of the 50 caliber machine guns with a few bursts to make sure they're functioning and they're not malfunctioning. You don't want to shoot at a FW-190 or an ME-109 and find out your machine gun doesn't work. So you give, the group leader will tell you when to fire, and he'll give you the precaution, so your gunners have to be sensitive and not fire into another B-17 beside you. And so all of this is in your mind now. All of this weighs pretty heavily on you. And you're not ready for any unexpected activities. And my top turret gunner, Red Schroetz, fired the two twin 50s in the top turret, and he could fire in a 380-degree circle, except when he came back to the rear end, he could not shoot off our tail. There were stops on the guns then, the electronic stops, so he couldn't shoot off his own tail. But he could put those twin 50s right over my head with a piece of metal about, maybe a 1/16 of an inch thick, and a plexiglass plate so I could look straight up over the pilot seat. And those twin 50s would be right over my head, you know, maybe 8 or 10, well, 10 or 12 inches above my head. And he'd wait until everybody else was firing, and I'd become used to the little bit of vibration you get, and some cordite smell. And he'd fire those twin 50s, 2 or 3 bursts, right over my head, and it sounded like all those bullets were going right through my head, not over the head. And it was always a great joy to Schroetz to see me jump right up against my seat belt and feel that B-17 bounce as I had to manhandle the wheel a little bit there. But that was his great joy. Some raids I was ready for it, and I'd turn around and grin at him, and then he'd go ahead and fire, and it didn't startle me. But I normally had enough on my mind so that I didn't think about that every time, and he could really get the adrenaline pumping here in the old boss.
Was that movie Sentimental Journey, was that pretty accurate or not?
Fairly so. Any movie has to build in a lot of emotion. to make it saleable and attractive. It wasn't as factual in terms of the combat experience as I think it might have been. I don't think Memphis Belle was quite as factual as it might have been. A little too much emotion there. You just, you either were calm, cool, and collected, or you were in a dead panic, and it just wasn't any, there wasn't any theatrics involved. But
so you didn't have your waist gunners beating the crap out of each other while fighters were coming in?
No, that didn't happen. That didn't happen. The bombardier, I guess the most excitement that we had was getting our bombardier out of the nose with his oxygen bottle and his chest pack on, back into the bomb bay to pull the wire controls out of the bomb fuses.
To arm the bombs?
To arm the bombs, yeah. To arm the bombs so that they would explode when they hit.
What were the little propeller-looking things on the bombs for?
They would unscrew the arm. You'd pull the wire safety out, and then those propellers would unscrew, and when they did, then the detonator, when the bomb hit, the detonator would explode the bomb.
So it wasn't fully, was it not fully armed until it was falling then, was it?
That's right. No, it was not fully armed until it was falling, and had fallen a little ways. We had, there was one raid, and it's in my diary, I've forgotten now where it was, where one of the crewmen had bought a little old sink at a junk shop in one of the English towns near our base, so that when he rode home, he could tell his parents that he threw everything at him, including the kitchen sink.
Oh, yeah?
But we used to ride all over the bombs, you know, happy birthday, Hitler, or...
Go to hell, you son of a bitch.
Well, things like that, yes.
This is the rider, the key grip.
There you are. Here's Babe. Here's the producer. Here's one of the...
Producer's hand.
One of the participants. And here's the star of the show right here with her behind towards you. Go, baby. Go, baby.
That's cool, man. Yeah, it is.
Boy, oh boy, look at that move. Thanks, pal.
Thank you.
Can you shut down out here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no problem.
Hey, sweet babe. Sweet babe. Well, I think I might go to bed, honey.
Good.
You shut off the gas?
Yeah, well. Let's see here, it's August 27th, 96.